The desert sun at Fort Irwin was merciless, baking the metal hulls of the tanks until they shimmered like beasts made of molten steel. Beneath one of them, half buried in dust and oil, Sergeant Elena Carter lay on her back, wrench in hand, tightening a stubborn bolt that refused to cooperate. Her hands were slick with grease, her face streaked with sweat, and yet her movements were precise, methodical, controlled, like a surgeon who knew the rhythm of her craft better than the beat of her own heart. To most people on base, Elena was just the mechanic, the quiet woman who spent more time with machines than with men. She didn't talk much, didn't smile often, and rarely joined the rowdy laughter that echoed from the barracks each night. But what they didn't know, what no one bothered to ask, was that she hadn't always been behind the repair line. There was a time when she sat inside those tanks, headset on, heart pounding as the engine roared beneath her. A time when she wasn't just fixing power, she was driving it. But that part of her story had been buried years ago. She still remembered the day they told her she'd been reassigned. The Army, in its cold efficiency, had reduced her to a line on a document. Due to departmental restructuring, your skill set will serve best in mechanical maintenance. Translation: we don't need you in combat anymore. No explanation. No appeal. Just paperwork. She'd taken off her crew patch, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her locker, where it stayed, hidden under a stack of manuals, like a secret too painful to throw away. "Hey, Carter!" A voice barked from outside the tank. It was Corporal Jensen, a 22-year-old with more ego than rank. "How long's it take to change a filter?" "We got drills in an hour." Elena slid out from under the tank, wiping her hands on a rag. "You could always help," she said calmly, her tone even, but Jensen smirked. "Help? Nah, you've got it covered. You're the tank whisperer, right?" He laughed and walked off, leaving dusty boot prints where she'd just cleaned. She shook her head, more tired than angry. She'd learned long ago that confrontation didn't earn respect in a place like this. Results did. And when it came to results, no one matched her. She could rebuild an M1 Abrams engine faster than most crews could load it onto a trailer. Her tools were extensions of her own will. Her timing flawless. But it didn't matter. Around here, she was invisible. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the base came alive with noise. Engines revving, orders shouted, drills starting. Elena stood near the edge of the field, wiping her hands, watching as the crews climbed into the very tanks she'd just repaired. The sound of the engines firing up filled her with an ache she couldn't name. It was like listening to a song she used to play, but could no longer touch. Her reflection in the metal armor stared back at her, small, warm, and silent. Later, as dusk fell, she walked to the maintenance shed, where the walls were lined with parts, gearboxes, hydraulic systems, cracked visors from the field. She worked long after everyone else had left. It wasn't just dedication, it was compulsion. Each nut she tightened, each engine she tuned, was a conversation with ghosts. The tanks didn't mock or question her. They only demanded precision, and in return, they gave her peace. Her father, a Vietnam veteran and mechanic himself, had once told her, "Machines don't lie. Ellie, they either work or they don't. People, that's another story." She'd carried that with her through boot camp, through deployment, through every disappointment. Maybe that's why she loved engines. They didn't care who you were, man or woman, sergeant or civilian. They just cared if you knew what you were doing. That night, as she cleaned her tools, a loud cheer echoed from the canteen nearby. She could hear the new recruits, the latest tank crew, laughing, bragging, and playing cards. They'd arrived only 2 days ago, but were already treating the base like their playground. She'd seen their commander, Lieutenant Blake Harrison, earlier, tall, confident, with the polished arrogance of someone who'd never been told no. The kind of man who looked at her and saw a grease-stained nobody. She wasn't wrong. Earlier that day, she'd walked past him in the motor pool, carrying a box of parts. He hadn't even noticed her until a bolt fell from her hand and clattered against the ground. He'd glanced over, smirked, and said, "Careful there, soldier. Wouldn't want you breaking something important." She'd said nothing, just nodded and moved on. But inside, a quiet storm brewed. It wasn't pride that fueled her. It was principle. She didn't want glory or recognition. She wanted fairness, respect, to be seen for what she could do, not what she looked like. But in the military, those lines blurred easily. A woman in a mechanic's uniform was just that, a worker, not a warrior. Still, she stayed, because somewhere deep down, she knew the machines would need her. And when they did, she'd be ready. The next morning, she was up before dawn. The sky was bruised purple, the air still cold. She sipped coffee from a metal mug as she checked her logbook. 6 tanks needed inspection before the afternoon drills. She climbed into the first one, running her hands over the controls, checking the ignition panel, tracing each line of circuitry like a pianist touching keys. She smiled faintly. Perfect. Then she moved to the next and froze. A hydraulic leak. Minor, but dangerous if ignored. She crouched, analyzing the crack in the line. Someone had patched it sloppily, probably one of the new guys trying to rush. She could already imagine the argument that would follow. But she didn't care. She replaced the line quietly, sealing it tight, making sure the system would hold. By the time the crew arrived, she was on her knees finishing up. "What's she doing under there?" Someone laughed. "She's always under there," another voice replied. "Probably in love with it." Elena didn't respond. She didn't need to. When the ignition roared flawlessly seconds later, the laughter stopped. For a brief moment, the only sound was the tank's steady hum, strong, perfect, alive. She stood, wiping sweat from her brow, and met Blake's gaze as he approached. "Guess you're good at what you do," he said reluctantly. "We'll see if it holds during the run." "It will," she replied simply, turning away before he could smirk again. Later that afternoon, as the tanks thundered across the practice field, she stood at the sidelines, clipboard in hand, eyes locked on the one she'd just repaired. The sound of its treads, the vibration of the ground beneath her boots, it awakened something inside her. The soldier she'd once been stirred, restless and alive. She could almost feel her hands on the controls again, the rhythm of motion, the rush of command. She didn't know it yet, but fate was already shifting in her direction, quietly, like gears beginning to turn after years of stillness. Soon, the world would stop calling her just the mechanic. And soon, she'd prove that the woman behind the wrench was capable of much more than fixing broken metal. She was about to fix history itself. The next morning, the motor pool buzzed with activity. Engines rumbled, voices echoed, and the smell of diesel mixed with desert dust. Elena Carter was already there, sleeves rolled up, her tools laid out in meticulous order. She liked mornings before the noise, before the egos arrived and the jokes began. Out here, before sunrise, it was just her and the machines. They didn't care who you were, only whether you could make them work. She had just finished testing a tank stabilizer when the new armored crew marched in. The base had been talking about them for days. A fresh deployment straight from Fort Benning, supposedly one of the elite teams. They carried themselves like they owned the place, all swagger and shine, the kind of soldiers who had memorized hero poses before they'd earned their stripes. At the head of the group was Lieutenant Blake Harrison. Tall, sharp-jawed, and clearly aware of both, Blake was the kind of officer who commanded a room before speaking. His uniform was immaculate, his confidence unshakable. And when he saw Elena kneeling beside a tank, grease on her arms and a wrench in her hand, his brow lifted ever so slightly, the way someone looks at a car that isn't theirs and isn't worth their time. "You the mechanic?" he asked, voice smooth but heavy with condescension. Elena stood, wiping her hands on a rag. "Yes, sir." "Sergeant Carter. I handle all maintenance and diagnostics for your unit's tanks." Blake nodded once, glancing at her name tag, then at the machine behind her. "Didn't expect to see a woman running the pit," he said casually. "Hope you can keep up with our pace." There it was. The line. Half a compliment, half a dismissal. She'd heard it all before. "I don't fall behind, sir," she said evenly. "Tanks can't afford it." One of the soldiers, a young, cocky corporal named Hughes, snickered. "Careful, Lieutenant. Sounds like she's got bite." Blake smirked. "Let's hope her tanks do too." They moved past her, laughing, tossing their duffel bags onto the ground beside the row of steel giants. Elena said nothing, though her jaw tightened. She turned back to her work, adjusting a pressure gauge, listening to the hiss of hydraulics instead of the sound of their mockery. The tanks never laughed. They just waited, silent, patient, faithful. Within the hour, she was deep inside the engine compartment, checking fluid lines, when she overheard the new crew arguing near the command tent. "I'm telling you, sir," Hughes said, "one of these hydraulic systems feels sluggish. Maybe Carter didn't torque it properly." Elena froze. The sound of her name in that tone, accusing, smug, was familiar. She took a breath, climbed out, and walked over. "The system isn't sluggish," she said, her voice steady. "It's overcompensating. Your calibration reading is off because you didn't reset the pressure valve after the last test run." The men turned to her. Blake crossed his arms. "And you know this how?" "Because I built that valve assembly myself," she replied. "If I didn't, you wouldn't have made it 50 meters this morning." For a heartbeat, silence. Then Hughes laughed. "You're kidding. You're saying we messed up the calibration?" "I'm saying I fixed it," Elena said simply. To prove her point, she climbed back up the tank, flicked the switch, and began typing commands into the onboard diagnostic panel. The machine beeped and hummed as she worked. The crew watched as the display flashed green, full system stability. She stepped down. "Now it'll respond in under half a second," she said, handing the tablet to Blake. "Check for yourself." He did. His expression hardened. The readings were perfect. "Well," he said after a pause, "looks like you got lucky." Elena met his eyes. "Luck doesn't turn wrenches, sir." He stared at her for a moment longer, then turned away, muttering something to his team. They laughed as they walked off, leaving her standing alone beside the tank. The sting hit her harder than she expected. Not the words, she was used to those, but the look in their eyes. The same one she'd seen 100 times before, disbelief wrapped in arrogance. The assumption that her success was coincidence, that she didn't belong. She went back to work, jaw clenched, forcing herself to focus on the rhythm of her tools. Click, tighten, lock, repeat. Metal didn't judge. It only yielded to precision. By afternoon, the desert heat had become unbearable. The crews took shade under the hangars, tossing footballs and drinking cold water, while Elena was still under the hood of Tank 17, tightening bolts with mechanical efficiency. Sweat rolled down her neck, stinging her eyes, but she didn't stop. "Hey, Carter." It was Jensen again, one of Blake's men. "You planning on living under there, or what?" Elena rolled out from beneath the tank, lifting her goggles. "If I do, at least the engines will run." The men laughed, not kindly, but nervously. They weren't sure if she was joking. Blake appeared again, watching her work. "We'll see how well that holds up in the field tomorrow," he said. "We're running combat drills at dawn. Try not to slow us down." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The machine she'd just finished roared to life, engine humming so smoothly it drowned out his words. Blake's smug grin faded just slightly as he turned away. That evening, as the sun sank into the desert horizon, Elena sat on the edge of the motor pool, staring at the long line of tanks gleaming in the fading light. The laughter of the men echoed faintly behind her, but she wasn't listening. Her mind was elsewhere, on the battlefield she once knew, the chaos, the adrenaline, the unity. She'd been part of a crew once, trusted, respected. They'd called her Ironheart back then, a nickname earned after she'd driven through a dust storm to rescue a stranded squad. Those days felt far away now. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small worn patch, her old crew insignia. The thread was frayed, but the symbol still clear, a coiled serpent wrapped around a steel wheel. She traced the edges with her thumb. "You'll get your moment again," she whispered under her breath. The next morning, the training exercise began. The crews climbed into their tanks, joking and shouting. Elena stood by with her checklist, scanning each engine's diagnostics as they powered up. Blake's crew climbed into their vehicle, the one she had personally restored the week before. "Try not to blow it up," Hughes called from the hatch. Elena didn't look up from her tablet. "It'll only blow if you drive it wrong." The men laughed again, but their laughter faded quickly as the tanks rolled out into the open desert. Elena stood by the radio tent, monitoring the transmissions. She listened as their voices crackled over the comms, jokes, commands, bursts of static. Everything was routine until Blake's voice cut through sharply. "Command, we've got a hydraulic fault. Pressure's dropping, left tread sluggish." Elena froze. That tank, her tank. She sprinted to the command tent, snatched the nearest headset, and patched into the channel. "Lieutenant Harrison, it's Carter. Run your diagnostics again. Override the auto balance. You're getting false readings from the auxiliary feed, Carter," he said, surprised. "We're in the middle of a live run." "Do it," she ordered. Her tone was steady, commanding. "Right now." There was silence for a second, then the hum of machinery through the radio. Moments later, Blake's voice came back. Pressure stabilized. "You were right." She allowed herself a small smile. "Told you it wasn't luck." When they returned to base, the crew was quiet, less laughter, fewer jokes. Hughes avoided eye contact. Blake nodded at her once, curtly, almost respectfully, though pride kept him from saying more. Elena didn't gloat. She simply hung up her tools, wiped her hands, and whispered to herself, "That's one step closer." Because she knew, deep down, the battlefield was calling again. And soon, no one would dare call her just the mechanic ever again. The morning started like any other. The roar of engines, the clatter of wrenches, and the smell of diesel floating through the dry Nevada air. But even before the first call came through the loudspeakers, Sergeant Elena Carter sensed something was different. There was tension in the air, a sharp, electric unease that hummed beneath the usual routine. Soldiers moved faster, voices sharper, radios buzzing with coded chatter she couldn't quite make out. Then came the announcement. "All armored units, report to briefing in 15 minutes. This is not a drill." The words hung heavy in the air. Around her, mechanics froze mid-motion. Elena's pulse quickened. Not a drill meant deployment, and deployment meant war. By the time she reached the hangar, the atmosphere was thick with adrenaline. Soldiers stood clustered around briefing tables, while officers handed out sealed envelopes. She caught sight of Lieutenant Blake Harrison and his crew in the crowd, the same men who'd mocked her days earlier. Their expressions were different now. Serious, focused. Even Blake's usual smirk had disappeared. Colonel Davis, the base commander, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Listen up. At 03:00 this morning, a U.S. convoy operating in northern Syria was ambushed by an armed militia believed to be linked to the Red Viper insurgents. 3 tanks were disabled and multiple vehicles destroyed. Our armored support unit has been activated for immediate reinforcement. A hush swept the room. You'll be wheels up by midnight, Davis continued. This is a live operation. Expect resistance. Our objective is to secure the supply route and recover stranded personnel. He paused, scanning the crowd. Maintenance personnel will deploy alongside the unit for field support. That includes mechanics, tech specialists, and recovery operators. Elena felt her breath catch. Field support. That meant her. A dozen soldiers turned to glance at her, some with raised eyebrows. She caught snippets of whispering. They're taking her? A mechanic in the field? But ignored them. Her mind was already racing ahead, planning what tools to pack, what spare parts might be needed, what repairs could be done under fire. After the briefing, she made her way to the logistics bay, where the deployment crates were being loaded. As she checked off her inventory list, welding tools, hydraulic kits, diagnostics tablet, a familiar voice interrupted. Carter. She turned. Blake stood there, arms folded, expression unreadable. You're going with us? She met his gaze evenly. Orders say the maintenance crew's embedded with the armored column. I go where the tanks go. He shook his head. This isn't a training field, Sergeant. It's not a garage. You'll be in live fire zones. I'm aware. For a moment, his confident facade cracked, replaced by something that almost looked like concern. Then he exhaled and nodded. Fine. Just stay behind the line. My men handle combat. I'll stay where I'm needed, she said quietly. That night, the base was alive with movement. The rhythmic clank of loading ramps, the low thrum of helicopters, the hiss of pneumatic doors. It was the sound of war in motion. Elena worked nonstop, securing spare engine parts and ammunition canisters. The hangar lights painted long shadows across her face as she checked every latch twice. She didn't believe in luck, but she believed in preparation. Inside her locker, she stared at the small patch she'd kept all these years, the coiled serpent emblem from her old unit. She hesitated, then tucked it into her vest pocket. Not for sentiment, but for reminder. She had unfinished business with the battlefield. By dawn, the convoy was rolling out. Rows of armored vehicles stretched across the tarmac. 20 Abrams tanks, 6 support trucks, and a handful of Humvees. The air smelled of jet fuel and sand. Elena climbed into the rear transport truck, surrounded by crates of spare parts. As the engines ignited, the vibration ran through her bones. For the first time in years, she felt alive. Hours later, the desert gave way to endless skies and open air. When the C-17 transport aircraft lifted off, she looked out the tiny window, Fort Irwin shrinking below her, swallowed by the horizon. Ahead of her, a new kind of silence waited. Blake's crew sat near the front of the aircraft, their laughter subdued, replaced by quiet anticipation. Even Hughes, the loudmouth gunner, looked uneasy. Elena caught fragments of their conversation over the drone of the engines. You think it's bad out there? They said 2 tanks already got hit last week. I heard the roads are lined with IEDs. Elena tuned them out, focusing on the steady rhythm of the flight. She wasn't nervous, not exactly. She'd been in combat zones before, but this time felt different. This time, she wasn't supposed to be there. She closed her eyes and thought of her father. The way he used to tell her, courage isn't about charging forward. It's about staying calm when everyone else runs. She took a breath and whispered, "I'm calm, Dad. I'm calm." When the plane finally touched down, the ramp opened to a wall of heat and dust. They were met by blinding sunlight and the sharp smell of diesel and gunpowder. The forward base was small, makeshift rows of tents, sandbag walls, and constant radio chatter. The distant rumble of explosions echoed faintly from somewhere far off. They were close to the real fight now. Blake's crew wasted no time unloading. Elena followed, lugging her toolkit through the sand. The air was thick, heavy with tension. She passed medics rushing stretchers toward a tent, soldiers cleaning rifles, mechanics shouting for parts. It was chaos, controlled chaos, but she felt right at home. A grizzled sergeant at the motor depot nodded at her. "You the mechanic from Irwin?" "Yes, sir." "Good. You're assigned to Alpha Platoon. They already lost one tech to shrapnel. They'll need you on standby 24/7. Understood." She set up her small workspace beside the tanks, a foldable bench. Her tools arranged neatly, diagnostics tablet charging beside a portable generator. Within an hour, she was elbow-deep in her first field repair, a fuel pressure regulator damaged from debris. Around her, the crew watched with mild amusement. Hughes muttered something under his breath. Blake didn't stop him. But when she finished, pressed the ignition, and the engine rumbled back to life, even he had to nod. "Guess she really can fix anything," Hughes said quietly. Blake said nothing, but his eyes lingered on her longer than before. That night, the camp buzzed under dim floodlights. The desert wind howled through the open gaps between tents, carrying dust and whispers. Elena sat on a crate outside her tent, cleaning her tools under the stars. The distant thunder of artillery rolled across the horizon, slow, ominous, rhythmic. Blake walked by, stopping when he saw her. "Can't sleep?" "Machines don't wait for morning," she said, smiling faintly. He hesitated, then sat across from her. "You've done good work. My men, they're not used to someone like you." She raised an eyebrow. "Someone like me?" He cleared his throat. "I mean, someone who doesn't flinch under pressure." "Pressure's relative," she said. "You handle it one bolt at a time." He chuckled softly. For the first time, his confidence didn't feel like arrogance. It felt human. Before he could say more, a sudden blast thundered in the distance, closer this time. Both of them froze. A voice crackled over the radio. "Enemy contact en route Echo. Convoy under attack, requesting immediate armored support." Elena's heartbeat quickened. Blake stood, voice sharp now. "That's us. Move." In seconds, the camp erupted into motion. Engines roared. Soldiers scrambled for their gear. Elena grabbed her toolkit without thinking. "Carter!" Blake shouted. "Stay here. This is live fire." But she was already climbing onto the transport truck, eyes locked on the glowing horizon where explosions bloomed like fiery blossoms. She turned to him, her voice firm. "You'll need me." He hesitated, then gave a single nod. The convoy surged forward into the night, tanks rumbling, sand flying, adrenaline thick in the air. Elena clutched the side rail, her heart pounding not with fear, but certainty. For the first time in years, she was exactly where she belonged. Not in the shadows, not behind the wrench, but heading straight into the fire. The desert was darker than ink when the convoy rolled out of base. Only the faint red glow of brake lights cut through the night as the line of armored beasts thundered across the sands. The wind howled against the hulls, carrying whispers of dust and distant gunfire. Sergeant Elena Carter sat in the rear of the lead support truck, gripping her helmet strap tight. Every vibration, every rattle of the steel beneath her, reminded her she was no longer in a safe zone. Lieutenant Blake Harrison's voice crackled through the comms. Alpha Platoon, maintain formation. Scanners show clear ahead. Stay sharp, people. The rhythmic hum of engines filled the silence. Each tank loomed like a metal giant, their turrets turning slightly, scanning the ridges. The only lights came from the faint glimmer of stars and the ghostly reflection of their night vision goggles. Elena tried to steady her breathing. She had been in combat zones before, but never like this, embedded with soldiers, vulnerable to the same threats they faced. She wasn't armed for battle. Her tools were her weapons, her mind her defense. The radio crackled again. Convoy approaching Route Echo. Entering Red Sector in 5. The air seemed to change, thicker, heavier, alive with unseen danger. The driver beside her muttered, "This is where it gets bad." Always quiet before the bite. Elena peered through the armored slit window. The desert stretched out endless and empty, too empty. Her gut twisted. Something was wrong. Then it happened. A blinding flash erupted ahead, followed by a deafening boom. The lead tank, Viper 1, vanished in a plume of fire and sand. The ground shook so violently that Elena slammed against the wall of the truck. "I'd. A voice screamed through the radio. Ambush! Enemy fire from the ridgeline. Chaos exploded around them. Gunfire ripped through the night, tracer rounds slicing red arcs across the darkness. Another explosion, closer this time, sent debris flying. The driver swore and swerved, barely avoiding the burning wreckage. Elena's pulse thundered in her ears. Her training kicked in. She ducked low, scanning the scene through the dust. 3 tanks were disabled, one smoking, one stuck in the sand, another's turret jammed at an odd angle. Sparks flew from its side as it tried to move. Alpha 6 to base, we are under heavy fire. Blake's voice cut through the chaos. Requesting air support. Repeat, we are pinned. Negative, came the static-laced reply. Air support grounded by sandstorm. You're on your own. A sandstorm. Of course. The horizon glowed faintly orange, the storm rolling in fast, swallowing the stars. Blake's tank halted near the burning lead vehicle. All units, defensive perimeter. Return fire. Machine guns roared to life. Muzzle flashes lit up the desert like fireworks. The enemy, unseen, fired from hidden positions on the ridges. Mortar rained down, carving holes into the sand. Elena's instincts screamed for her to stay put, but her eyes locked on the jammed tank, Viper 3. Its crew was trapped inside, unable to move or rotate the turret. Every second they sat still made them an easy target. She shouted to the driver, "Stop the truck." He turned, horrified. "Are you insane? They're sitting ducks. I can fix it." Before he could respond, she grabbed her toolkit and flung the door open. The desert air hit her like a wall of heat and sand. Bullets tore into the ground around her boots as she sprinted through the chaos. "Carter, get back here." Blake's voice roared over the radio. But she didn't listen. She dropped to her knees beside the crippled tank. Sparks flew as she pried open the rear hatch. Inside, 2 crew members were coughing, eyes wide with fear. "Who the hell are you?" One yelled. "Mechanic," she shouted back, crawling inside. "You want to live? Move over." The interior was a mess. Wires ripped, gears jammed, a hydraulic valve cracked from the blast. She could barely hear over the roar of gunfire outside. She reached for her wrench, teeth clenched, and got to work. Every second counted. She rewired the stabilizer controls, patched a fluid line with a strip of her sleeve, and slammed the valve back into place. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were precise. She didn't have time for fear. A mortar shell exploded nearby, shaking the tank violently. A metal shard grazed her shoulder, slicing through her jacket. She hissed in pain, but didn't stop. "Try it now," she yelled to the gunner. He hit the ignition. The tank sputtered, then roared to life. The crew cheered. "We've got power." "Good," she said, grabbing the hatch handle. "Now fight back." As she leapt from the tank, its turret turned and fired. The explosion lit up the ridge, scattering the enemy gunners. Blake's voice came through again, this time different, controlled, sharp. "Who the hell just brought Viper 3 back online?" Elena pressed the radio button on her vest. Mechanic did. For a moment, silence. Then Blake's tone changed, disbelief mixed with something like pride. "Copy that, Mechanic. You just saved their lives." The fight raged for another 20 minutes. With 3 tanks operational again, the convoy pushed forward, firing in coordinated bursts. The storm rolled in, cutting visibility to almost zero, but it worked in their favor, masking their retreat route. When the shooting finally stopped, the only sounds were wind and the hiss of burning metal. The radio crackled with updates. Enemy retreat confirmed. All units accounted for. Minor casualties. Elena sat in the sand, breathing hard. Her uniform was ripped, her hands covered in oil and blood. She stared at the smoldering wreckage around her, the price of survival. Blake's tank approached slowly, its headlights dim through the dust. He climbed out, his face streaked with dirt. Without a word, he walked over and crouched beside her. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said quietly. "I fixed your tank," she replied, meeting his eyes. He stared at her for a long moment and nodded once. "You did more than that. You kept us alive." She exhaled shakily, exhaustion finally sinking in. Her hands trembled as she tried to wipe the grease off her cheek. Blake reached out, stopping her. "Leave it," he said. "You earned it." Around them, the platoon gathered, tired, battered, but alive. The men who once dismissed her now looked at her with something different. Respect. That night, as the storm howled around their makeshift camp, Elena sat inside the damaged truck, patching her own shoulder with a field dressing. Outside, soldiers repaired what was left of their vehicles, their voices low and reverent. Someone called her name. "Hey, Mechanic." Hughes, the loudmouth gunner, leaned in the doorway, grinning despite the bandage on his head. "Heard you drove straight into hell and brought a tank back with you." She smirked. "That's an exaggeration. Not from where we were sitting," he said. "You're one of us now." He tossed her a canteen of water, then disappeared into the night. Elena leaned back, listening to the distant hum of engines. For the first time, she felt something shift inside her, a quiet certainty that she belonged not just as a mechanic, but as a soldier. Still, she knew this was only the beginning. The convoy would roll again soon, deeper into enemy territory, and the dangers ahead would make tonight look small. But for now, she allowed herself one breath of peace, one moment of stillness beneath the storm. Outside, the desert wind carried the echoes of battle away, leaving behind only the sound of a woman who refused to stay in the shadows anymore. The morning after the ambush was eerily quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the desert painted in a dull gray haze. Ash and dust blanketed everything, the tanks, the trucks, even the soldiers' faces. The convoy had survived the night, but the silence that hung over the camp was heavy with exhaustion and loss. Sergeant Elena Carter emerged from her tent, the strap of her vest slung loosely over one shoulder. Her muscles ached, her hands were blistered, and her shoulder throbbed beneath the bandage. But she was alive. And so was every soldier in Alpha Platoon, thanks to her. As she walked toward the maintenance zone, she passed the wreckage of Viper 1, the tank that had taken the first hit. Its hull was twisted, blackened, and still smoking faintly. A small flag fluttered on its side, planted there by one of the crew to honor their fallen driver. Elena paused, her gaze distant. She'd seen death before, but something about seeing a machine she loved, and the men inside it, reduced to ruin, struck deeper. She tightened her jaw and kept walking. Blake was already there, hunched over a tablet displaying topographic maps. His uniform was still streaked with soot, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He looked up when he saw her. "Morning, mechanic," he said, voice rough but steady. "Morning, Lieutenant," she replied. "Engines are being checked. Viper 3's hydraulics are holding up. I patched them properly this time." A faint smirk tugged at his lips. "I never doubted you. Liar." He chuckled softly, then grew serious. "Command just confirmed. We're moving out again tonight. New objective, push north, secure the Red Ridge Pass. Intelligence says the militia regrouped there." Elena frowned. "Already? The vehicles aren't even fully repaired." "I don't make the orders," he said, staring at the map. "But we move or lose momentum. We'll be running blind out there." As if on cue, a figure approached, Captain Miller, the field operations officer. His crisp uniform contrasted sharply with the weary faces around him. He carried himself like a man who hadn't been in a firefight for years. "Harrison," Miller said curtly, "Command's orders are clear. You move at 2,100 hours. And this time, no delays. I want that pass secured before dawn." Blake nodded reluctantly. "Understood." Miller's eyes shifted to Elena. "And this is the mechanic everyone's been talking about." She met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir. I read the after-action report," he said, his tone measured. "You disobeyed protocol. Left your vehicle under fire. That kind of stunt could have gotten you killed, or worse, others distracted." "With respect, sir," she replied evenly. "If I hadn't, Viper 3 would have been destroyed. So would its crew." Miller's jaw tightened. "You're not a soldier, Sergeant. You're a technician. Stay in your lane." The air between them tensed. Blake stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "With respect, sir, she saved my men. She earned the right to be here." Miller gave him a cold look, then turned on his heel and walked away. Elena exhaled, shaking her head. "Guess not everyone's a fan." "He's old school," Blake muttered. "A type who thinks the battlefield is no place for mechanics or women." "Then he's in for a long deployment," she said, returning to her workbench. For the rest of the day, the camp buzzed with rebuilding efforts. Elena supervised field repairs, trained a few younger soldiers on basic diagnostics, and even modified one tank's sensor system to detect thermal spikes from IEDs. It wasn't regulation approved, but it worked. By sunset, the convoy was ready. The horizon burned orange, the desert winds calm for once. As the tanks lined up, Elena climbed onto the back of Viper 3, tightening the last bolt on the engine casing. She looked out across the sand, a vast, unforgiving world that could swallow them whole in seconds. Blake approached, helmet under his arm. "You sure you're up for this? You've already done more than enough." She glanced at him. "You said it yourself. It's not over yet." He smiled faintly. "Just try not to fix any tanks while they're moving this time. No promises." The convoy rolled out again as darkness swallowed the desert. Headlights off, night vision on, they advanced in silence. The terrain grew rougher. Jagged rocks, narrow passes, shadows that seemed to move on their own. Elena sat in the back, scanning readings on her tablet. The modified sensor blinked steadily, detecting nothing unusual. Then, a flicker. She frowned, zooming in. The thermal spikes were faint, but rhythmic, not natural. "Lieutenant," she called over comms, I'm reading heat signatures ahead. Small, scattered. Could be decoys or... Before she could finish, the radio cut to static. A split second later, a flash erupted behind them. One of the support trucks exploded into flames. Contact. Rear flank. Someone shouted. Gunfire erupted again, not from the ridges this time, but from inside the valley walls. Ambush. Helena ducked as bullets pinged off the tank's armor. Blake barked orders over the radio, trying to rally the formation. But something was different this time. The attack was coordinated, precise. The enemy knew exactly where they'd be, and when. Blake's voice grew sharp. How the hell did they know our route? These coordinates were classified. Elena's stomach sank. The convoy's movements had been last minute. Only command had access to them. Someone had leaked their location. Through the chaos, she saw Captain Miller's transport speeding away from the fight, not toward the front, but back toward open ground. Blake saw it too. He's retreating? Or running from something, Helena said. Her gut twisted. Lieutenant, that's not retreat. That's escape. Blake's eyes narrowed. You think he... think? No, I know. Another explosion rocked the ground, cutting them off. The militia pushed harder, pressing closer with RPGs and machine guns. Blake slammed his fist against the console. We can't hold this position. Elena's voice came through the coms, steady but urgent. Then we move. East Ridge, there's cover near the canyon wall. I can reroute the damaged tanks through the gap if you give me 5 minutes. Make it 3. The next few minutes were chaos. Elena sprinted through gunfire again, disconnecting fuel lines, patching leaks, forcing engines to life through sheer willpower. Bullets zipped past, sparks flew, and every sound was deafening. Finally, the tanks roared back into motion, pushing toward the East Ridge. She jumped aboard the last one as it moved, clutching the railing tight as they barreled through the dust and smoke. Behind them, Miller's transport vanished over the dunes, the radio picking up his last words, before cutting off completely. Red Viper. This is Falcon. The package is moving as planned. The world seemed to stop. Elena stared at the receiver, disbelief washing over her. Red Viper. Blake's voice came through, rough and strained. What did you just hear? She replayed the transmission, her voice shaking. He wasn't retreating. He was coordinating with them. The realization hit like a gut punch. Captain Miller, their commanding officer, was the mole. The ambush wasn't random. It was planned. Blake's tone hardened. Then we stopped running. We hunted down. The remaining tanks regrouped under the ridge, engines rumbling low. The desert fell quiet again, save for the distant echo of retreating gunfire. The men were battered, confused, but alive. Elena stood beside Blake, her face smeared with grease and dust. We can't call for extraction. Comms are jammed. If he gets back to the main base, he'll feed them every position we have. Blake nodded grimly. Then we find him before he gets there. Their eyes met. No more walls, no more doubts. Just resolve. The convoy would not only fight to survive now, they would fight to stop a traitor from burning the whole mission to ash. As the sun began to rise behind them, turning the dunes blood red, Elena climbed into the tank beside Blake. The wind whipped through the open hatch as the engines growled back to life. The mechanic who once stayed behind the lines was now driving straight toward betrayal and the battle of her life. The desert at dawn was a world of fire and silence. The rising sun painted the dunes in streaks of gold and crimson, and the wrecks of burned-out trucks cast long shadows across the sand. Sergeant Elena Carter stood beside her tank, the warm wind tugging at her scarf. Her eyes locked on the horizon, where Captain Miller had vanished hours earlier. Every instinct pulled her not to rest, not to let the trail grow cold. Betrayal had a scent, and she could still feel it in the air. Lieutenant Blake Harrison approached, his helmet under one arm, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. But behind the fatigue burned something fierce, purpose. "Scouts confirmed tire tracks heading northeast," he said, pointing to the faint grooves in the sand. "He's traveling light, no escort, no heavy transport. Probably trying to reach the forward outpost at Damas Ridge before we can." Elena adjusted the strap of her rifle. "If he gets there, we lose him, and the enemy gets everything." Blake nodded grimly. "Then we move. But we're running low on fuel and ammo. We'll have to make the next engagement count." Around them, the remaining soldiers of Alpha Platoon were rearming, patching holes in the tanks and loading what little ammunition they had left. The unit had started with nearly 24 vehicles. Now only 5 remained operational. The rest lay scattered across the sand like fallen beasts. Elena crouched beside Viper 3, checking the engine temperature. Should make it another 50 miles before overheating. After that, we'll be pushing luck. 50 miles should be enough, Blake said. The men were listening now, not out of obligation, but trust. When Elena spoke, they paid attention. When Blake issued orders, they followed without question. The battlefield had changed them both. Within the hour, the convoy rumbled forward, 5 tanks and a single support truck cutting through the dunes like ghosts. The radio stayed silent, except for the occasional static pop. They were deep in no man's land now, too far from command for help, too close to the truth to turn back. Elena sat in the co-driver's seat beside Blake, her eyes scanning the desert through binoculars. The heat shimmered off the sand like liquid glass. "You think Miller planned this from the start?" she asked quietly. Blake's jaw tightened. He knew our routes, our supply timing, our communications encryption. He was always one step ahead of us. I just didn't see it. You couldn't have known. He glanced at her. You did. You sensed something was wrong before the second ambush. Elena gave a faint smile. Mechanics listen to sounds people ignore. The same applies to people. They drove on in silence for a while. The hum of the engine was almost hypnotic until a sudden flash of movement caught her eye. "Hold up," she said sharply. Blake braked. Sand kicked up around them. Elena zoomed in on a ridge ahead, fresh tracks, too shallow for a tank, too deep for a bike. She adjusted her lens. "Miller," she whispered. "He's close." Blake keyed the radio. "All units, halt formation. Dismount and reckon on foot. We're not rolling into another trap." The soldiers spread out cautiously, weapons raised. The sun was higher now, turning the dunes into blinding mirrors of light. Every movement looked like a mirage. Elena and Blake moved together, crouching behind a half-buried wreck. Through the binoculars, she saw it, a small Cums truck partially hidden under camouflage netting. The use markings were crudely painted over. "That's him," Blake muttered. "And he's broadcasting." They could see the faint flicker of an antenna, the low hum of a powered generator. Miller stood beside it, speaking into a satellite handset. His uniform was unbuttoned, dust covering his once-polished boots. But there was no mistaking the betrayal in his stance, casual, confident, unhurried. Elena's blood boiled. "He's giving them our coordinates." Blake lowered his binoculars, his voice low but steady. "Not for long." He signaled the nearest sniper team, but before they could line up the shot, Miller's voice echoed faintly across the desert, carried by the wind. Your commander, the mechanic, is with them?" "The woman. She's the reason the last ambush failed." Elena froze. Her heart pounded. "He's selling me out." Blake's expression hardened. "He's selling us all out." Then, As if sensing their presence, Miller turned, raising a pair of binoculars. For a moment, their eyes met across the sands. Then he ducked into the truck. "Move!" Blake shouted. The tanks roared to life, engines screaming as they surged forward. Miller's vehicle spun its tires, kicking up sand as it sped across the ridge. Bullets whipped through the air as Alpha Platoon opened fire. Elena gripped the side rail of the tank, shouting coordinates. "He's heading for the canyon path. Cut him off at the south ridge." The chase tore across the dunes, engines howling, guns firing in short, controlled bursts. Miller's truck darted between rock outcroppings, barely staying ahead. The air was thick with dust and gunpowder. Then the traitor made his move. He veered sharply left, disappearing into a narrow canyon, one too tight for tanks. "Damn it," Blake cursed. "We can't follow in these." Elena jumped off the side of the tank, landing hard in the sand. "Then I'll go on foot." Blake stared. "You'll never make it alone." "I'm not alone," she said, pointing to the ridge above. 2 soldiers were already scaling it, providing overwatch. He hesitated, then handed her his sidearm. "Be careful." She nodded, slipping it into her belt and sprinting into the canyon. The narrow walls trapped the heat like an oven. Every breath burned her lungs. She moved quickly but cautiously, her eyes darting to every shadow. Somewhere ahead, she could hear the hum of Miller's truck engine echoing off the rocks. Finally, she saw him, standing beside the comms unit again, talking frantically into the radio. His voice was clear now, filled with venom. "They don't know I'm transmitting. The Red Vipers can hit them from the north. Finish the convoy. I'll bring the intel myself." Elena raised the pistol. "You won't be bringing anything." Miller froze and slowly turned, hands half raised. His expression shifted from shock to mock amusement. "Well," he said softly, the mechanic finally got her hands dirty. "You betrayed your men," she said, her voice cold. "You killed soldiers who trusted you." He shrugged. "I traded lives for strategy. That's what command is, not about morality, about leverage." "You sold leverage to terrorists," she snapped. Miller smiled faintly. "You think this war has sides anymore? Everyone's selling something." He lunged. Elena fired once, a warning shot that ricocheted off the canyon wall. He kept coming. She swung the pistol sideways, catching him across the jaw. He stumbled but recovered fast, drawing his own weapon. They grappled in the sand, trading blows. She was smaller but faster, every move precise, controlled. He fought like a man desperate, cornered. His elbow caught her wounded shoulder, making her gasp in pain. He shoved her back, raising his gun, but she grabbed a wrench from her belt and hurled it. It struck his wrist, knocking the pistol away. In the moment of hesitation that followed, she surged forward and slammed him against the rock. "This is for my platoon," she hissed, pressing the pistol to his chest. Miller sneered. "You don't have the guts." She stared into his eyes, the eyes of a man who thought power excused everything. Then she fired once into the ground beside him, close enough to spray sand into his face. "I don't need to kill you," she said quietly. "I just need to make sure you face what you did." Behind her, the rumble of engines echoed again. Blake and his men arrived, weapons drawn. Miller dropped to his knees, defeated. "Get him in cuffs," Blake ordered. "He's going to answer for every life he sold." Elena turned away, breathing hard. The canyon wind tugged at her hair, carrying away the last echo of gunfire. Blake approached slowly. "You did good." She shook her head. "I did what I had to." He looked at her, really looked, and saw the exhaustion, the grit, the fire that hadn't dimmed. "You saved us again, Carter." "You saved me." Elena didn't answer. She just stared toward the horizon, where the sun blazed over the dunes like a promise and a warning. They had caught the traitor. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. Miller's betrayal wasn't an isolated act. It was part of something larger, darker. And whatever it was coming for all of them. The desert sun hung low over the dunes, casting long shadows across the captured construct where Captain Miller sat restrained. His hands were bound behind his back, a makeshift gag removed only when interrogation began. Sergeant Elena Carter and Lieutenant Blake Harrison approached, their boots crunching against the sand, the weight of the day evident in their every movement. Alpha Platoon had secured the canyon, but the air remained thick with tension. Every soldier kept a wary eye on the horizon, knowing that while Miller had been captured, the enemy could still strike at any moment. Blake crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the truck. "Talk," he said, his tone blunt. "Everything. Who's behind the Red Vipers? What's the plan?" Miller smirked, faintly amused, as if he had all the time in the world. "You think you've won anything?" he said slowly. "You're just pawns in a game bigger than your little platoon." "Try me," Elena interjected, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly from fatigue and adrenaline. "You betrayed your men. You led them to death. Now tell us everything, or you'll spend the rest of your life wishing you had." For a moment, Miller's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of something else, calculation. He leaned forward, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The Red Vipers. They're not just insurgents. They're funded by shadow operators. Arms, intel, infiltration. It's all coordinated to destabilize the entire region. And you, all of you, just made it easier for them." Elena's eyes narrowed. "And you?" "I was placed here to ensure key intelligence didn't fall into the wrong hands. Command gave me clearance to liaise, but I saw opportunity," he admitted casually, as if explaining the weather. "I sold intel, yes, but I was never supposed to be stopped. You intercepted the operation before it could be completed." Blake's jaw clenched. "You're a traitor, not a strategist. Your clearance means nothing now." Miller shrugged. "Maybe, but the Red Vipers aren't finished. Even if I'm caught, they'll act. There's a secondary plan, one you wouldn't understand without context." Elena's mind raced. Secondary plan? That meant the ambushes, the sabotage, the deception. It was all part of a larger puzzle. And somehow, Miller had been manipulating it from within. "Tell us where," she demanded, her voice firm. "Every piece of intel you have. Every coordinate, every contact." Miller chuckled darkly. "I thought you'd understand the game mechanic, but maybe you're just a wrench in a machine you don't comprehend. Fine. There's a cache, weapons. Comes explosives, hidden near the northern ridge. Coordinates embedded in the satellite logs I transmitted earlier. They'll move tonight. Your platoon won't survive if you don't stop them." Elena felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. The secondary strike could destroy the entire convoy, and possibly the forward base. Blake's hand went to his sidearm, then he stopped himself. "We're taking the team and moving on foot," he decided. "The tanks can't traverse the northern pass safely. We'll hit them before they mobilize." Elena grabbed her toolkit. "Then we'll need explosives, sabotage kits, anything that can slow them down." The platoon readied themselves in tense silence. Every soldier knew the stakes. Failure wasn't an option. Not now. Not ever. By dusk, the convoy had moved to the northern ridge under the cover of darkness. Elena led the mechanics and a small strike team ahead, navigating jagged rock formations and narrow canyon trails. The Red Vipers' positions were well camouflaged, making every step a potential trap. Blake kept watch over the team as they approached the first checkpoint. "Stay sharp," he whispered. They'll be expecting us to try something. Elena nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. She wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was the strategist, the lifeline of her platoon, the difference between survival and annihilation. Suddenly, a faint click echoed in the rocks. Elena froze. It was subtle, but her instincts screamed tripwire. She gestured to the team, signaling them to halt. Carefully, she knelt and examined the ground. There it was, a thin wire stretched across the path, leading to a small explosive. "Hide," she whispered. "Secondary trigger." Blake gritted his teeth. "Good catch. Disarm it." Elena's fingers moved deftly, her years of training and battlefield experience guiding her. The wire was delicate, but her hands were steady. Within moments, the explosive was neutralized. "Clear," she said, standing and signaling the team forward. The northern ridge loomed ahead, shadows stretching across sand and rock. Through night vision goggles, the glow of small fires revealed enemy positions, tents, and guarded caches. Every detail was a threat. Elena checked the coordinates Miller had given them, cross-referencing with the satellite logs she accessed through her tablet. The numbers matched. Explosives and comms caches were directly ahead, about 500 meters beyond the ridge's crest. "We move in waves," Blake instructed. "Alpha goes left, Bravo right? Mechanic, you're with me. We'll neutralize the main cache." Elena's pulse quickened. Neutralize the main cache. She tightened her grip on the toolkit and pistol. The time for observation was over. The team advanced, silent but deadly. Each movement measured, each footfall deliberate. The Red Vipers had no idea the strike team was approaching. Within moments, they were in position, crouched behind rocks 50 meters from the main cache. Blake signaled. Elena sprang forward, sprinting the last few meters to the cache. Her toolkit flew open. She set to work with precision, rigging small charges to disable the explosives safely and cutting power to the comms arrays. Sparks flew, wires sizzled, but she worked faster than even she thought possible. Behind her, gunfire erupted. Bravo team had been discovered, and a firefight ensued. Elena's heart pounded, but she stayed focused. One by one, she neutralized the remaining devices. Then came the most critical step, a large crate of explosives, booby-trapped with multiple triggers. One wrong move, and the entire ridge would blow. Elena's fingers flew over the controls, testing circuits, bypassing triggers. Sweat streamed down her face, but her hands didn't shake. Finally, a click. The crate was disabled. "Cache secure," she whispered into the radio. Blake's voice came back, strained but relieved. "Good work, Carter. Get back here. We've still got enemy to neutralize." As the team regrouped, Elena caught a fleeting glance of Miller, being escorted under guard toward the ridge's edge. His eyes met hers, a mix of fear and defiance. She didn't respond. The night was far from over, but for the first time, Elena allowed herself a moment of clarity. She had stopped a disaster, thwarted a betrayal, and taken charge of her destiny in the sand. Yet, as the team prepared for the final push, a chilling thought lingered. The Red Vipers were organized, ruthless, and relentless. And Miller's information hinted at a threat far greater than they had imagined. Elena looked to Blake. "Whatever happens next," she said, voice steady, "we finish this together." Blake nodded, his eyes shadowed but resolute. "Together," he repeated. The night swallowed them again as Alpha Platoon advanced deeper into the northern ridge. Every step was measured. Every breath could be the last. The desert whispered around them, a silent witness to betrayal, courage, and the making of heroes. And far ahead, unseen, the Red Vipers prepared for the clash that could decide the fate of the convoy. The base, and the lives of everyone under Elena Carter's watch. The desert was alive with tension as night deepened. Alpha platoon crouched behind jagged rock formations, their weapons ready, their breaths shallow. The northern ridge sprawled ahead, shrouded in shadows, every flicker of light hinting at danger. Sergeant Elena Carter checked her toolkit one last time. Her uniform was tattered, her hands blackened with grease and blood, but her eyes burned with purpose. The raid on the Red Viper's caches had given them a critical advantage, but the final confrontation loomed. This was the fight that could decide the fate of the convoy, and possibly the base. Lieutenant Blake Harrison whispered orders. Alpha moves left. Bravo, right? Suppression fire on my mark. Carter, you and I neutralize Miller. Ready? Elena's nod was sharp. Ready. They moved in silence, shadows among shadows, feet sinking into soft sand. Every rock formation was a potential ambush. Every step could be a trap. Ahead, they spotted the enemy's command post, a fortified tent cluster with armed guards, tripwires, and makeshift barricades. Miller was there, orchestrating, gesturing, barking orders. He didn't notice the strike team approaching, believing his escape route secured. Elana's pulse accelerated. Her hands gripped her pistol, her toolkit slung over her shoulder. The night smelled of dust, gunpowder, and fear, the battlefield alive and breathing around them. Blake gave the signal. Alpha and Bravo teams opened fire simultaneously. The ridge erupted into chaos. Tracer rounds arced through the air, sand and debris flying with every shot. The Red Vipers scrambled to respond, surprised by the coordinated strike. Elena ducked behind a rock, firing her sidearm at advancing fighters. Then she sprinted toward the main command post, using her agility to evade bullets. Sparks flew as she threw a small grenade near a guard tower, disorienting the enemy. Inside the cluster of tents, Miller realized too late that he was trapped. Soldiers! Stop them! He shouted, desperation cracking his tone. Elena rounded the largest tent, spotting the Cums crate, the one she had previously disabled, but that now could be reset to alert reinforcements. Time was critical. She sprinted toward it, crouching behind a low wall of sandbags. Miller stepped out, pistol in hand. Carter, drop it, she yelled, keeping her pistol trained. He laughed, bitter and defiant. You think you've won? You can't stop the plan. Even if I die, they'll still take control. Elena's fingers tightened on the trigger. Not tonight. He fired, forcing her to duck, sand exploding around her. Using the moment, she lunged forward, rolling over the crates, wrenching the rifle from his grip with precise motion. They grappled, the desert wind whipping around them, gun metal and sweat colliding. Blake arrived just as Miller tried to pull another weapon from his belt. With a swift kick, Blake disarmed him. Miller stumbled, cornered at last. Enough, Blake growled. You answer for this. Elena stepped forward, breathing hard, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. It's over, she said firmly. No one else dies tonight because of you. The sound of the platoon pushing the remaining Red Vipers back echoed around the canyon. Shots rang out, punctuated by shouts, the rattle of automatic fire, and the occasional explosion as the team neutralized remaining threats. Elena moved from crate to crate, disarming makeshift IEDs Miller had planted around the tents. Each device neutralized was a life saved. The weight of responsibility was immense, but she didn't falter. Miller slumped against a tent, glaring at her. You think this changes anything? The Red Vipers are everywhere. You've only delayed the inevitable. You underestimated me, she replied, tightening the restraints around his wrists. And you underestimated my platoon. Outside, the battle raged, but slowly the tide turned. Red Vipers fled under suppressive fire, surrendering or retreating into the canyon's labyrinthine trails. One by one, Alpha platoons secured the ridge. The desert echoed with the sounds of victory, but at a cost. A few soldiers were injured, and the convoy had sustained damages. Elena finally stepped back, surveying the aftermath. Tanks were scarred, vehicles scorched, but every surviving soldier of Alpha platoon was accounted for. She breathed deeply, the adrenaline ebbing away, leaving exhaustion and relief in its place. Blake approached her, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. "You did it," he said softly. "You stopped him, Carter. You saved lives tonight." Elena shook her head. "We did it, together." Miller, restrained and silent, watched them. The arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by the dull sheen of defeat. Elena felt no satisfaction in it. Justice was done, but the cost of betrayal lingered. By dawn, the platoon had regrouped, securing the ridge fully. Field medics tended to the wounded, soldiers checked vehicles, and engineers began patching communication lines. Elena returned to the tanks, inspecting engines, hydraulic lines, and weapon systems. She had learned long ago that the battle didn't end with enemies captured. It ended when the equipment and soldiers were ready to fight again. As she worked, Blake joined her. "You've changed everything," he said quietly. "Not just the mission. The way my men see you?" "I'm not asking for their approval," Elena replied. "I'm asking for survival, theirs and mine." Blake chuckled softly. "I get that now. But they respect you, Carter. That's earned." She paused, wiping grease from her hands. "It wasn't easy, but it was necessary." The convoy, battered but functional, prepared to return to the forward base. Miller was securely restrained and set to be transported to command for interrogation. The Red Vipers had been driven off, their secondary caches destroyed or disabled. For the first time in days, the desert felt quieter. As the convoy moved, Elena climbed atop Viper 3, scanning the horizon. The sun rose, washing the sand in gold. She thought of the lives lost, the soldiers who had fought bravely, and the trust that had been forged in fire. Blake approached and stood beside her, looking out over the dunes. "You ever think about going back? To a normal life?" he asked quietly. Elena shook her head. "There's no going back. Not after this. Not when there's more out there that needs fixing. Saving." He nodded, understanding. "Then we keep moving forward, together." For the first time in her military career, Elena allowed herself a small, genuine smile. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked. But tonight, she had proven, not just to them, but to herself, that courage, skill, and determination could change the course of fate. The desert stretched endlessly before them, but for the first time, it no longer felt hostile. It felt like a proving ground, a place where she had been forged into something stronger, someone who could stand unflinching in the face of betrayal, fire, and impossible odds. As the convoy rolled toward safety, the sun climbing higher, Elena Carter felt a sense of resolution wash over her. She had fought, survived, and led. She was no longer just a mechanic. She was a soldier, a strategist, and a hero, a force the battlefield would never underestimate again. The Red Vipers had been stopped, the traitor captured, and the convoy saved. But in the back of her mind, Elena knew one truth above all. War never truly ended, and every battle left its mark. She didn't care. She was ready for whatever came next. And with the rising sun painting the desert gold, Elena Carter drove her tank forward into the future she had earned.